speech, which usually doesn't happen until the end of whatever session I'm presiding over commences. So I'll just start the timer and I'll just look at it myself.
Oh yeah, I can do that. I didn't know you were giving us.
Yeah. Okay.
My mind has graduated already. Okay. So it's 2:30, and 2:55,
Yeah.
and then I can start hitting
And
you.
you-
with
I remember the last time I went to jail. I was 8, and I sat there for 3 long turns until I finally rolled the dice correctly and got my get out of jail free card. Fortunately for those prisoners in private prisons, their time isn't as excruciating as my Monopoly experience was. And because of this, stand with me in negation for 2 reasons. The first being because private prisons are already being monitored. And the second reason being is that private prisons actually offer better healthcare programs than those public sector prisons. But first, Stephen Crawford of the Department of Justice points out in November of 1998 that of the 89 contracts for which there exists information on private prisons, 52% of them report having monitors in place right now, on site, on a daily basis. These monitors generally work full-time, managing multiple cases. Ms. Tran, you tell us that there is simply no monitoring that occurs in the status quo, but unfortunately, that's not true for a majority of those prisons outlined. Mr. Crawford continues that of the 28 state and federal government agencies that operated possessing contracts, 20 reported monitors in addition to contract administrators. That means that those individuals who run private prisons had to obtain contracts and go through background checks to obtain a certificate to begin with. If they weren't qualified to do this, they wouldn't have obtained a certificate. That's reason enough to vote negation. But where the real problem is, as Mr. Crawford outlines, is in the public sector. Ms. Tran, you tell us that violence is extraordinarily high across prisons throughout the U.S. But what you tell us in that is that that isn't specific to private prisons, but rather that's specific to prisons everywhere. Meaning that we should curb violence not only on a private level, but on a public level. But the second reason that we're going to stand in negation is because private prisons actually offer better healthcare programs. According to Curtis Blakely of the CARA Federal Probation Journal in the year 2004, the private sector reported an average of 28% of their inmate population participating in rehabilitation programs. And this is key in looking to the future, because rehabilitation programs are actually very important in curbing recidivism rates in the long term. And this is something that's important when looking to the functioning of a prison overall, because ideally, going to a prison should disincentivize you from ever coming back. And because private prisons do this better than the public sector by implementing these types of rehabilitation programs, stand with me and negate there. Because as Mr. Blakely points out, only 14% of the prison populations on a public scale participated in these rehabilitation programs. And in the long term, these benefits are very minimal for those public sector prisons. Please stand with me in negation of this piece of legislation and rather work towards improving the public sector and ultimately removing their excruciating pain that exists, much like my Monopoly experience.
Thank you for that speech in the negation of 2 minutes and 55 seconds. Seeing that that was a speech in the first negation, we are now in line for 2 minutes of mandatory questioning.
All questioners, please.
Questioners, please rise. Representative Conley.
So passing this bill would do nothing for the charges of the abuse from inmates?
It largely could, but the problem doesn't exist in the private sector, as I pointed out. The problem exists across prisons throughout the U.S. and individual states, as Ms. Tran pointed out.
Representative Ong.
Mr. Goulet, how many of these private prison corporations are going to be affected by this bill?
Seeing as though all of those private prisons corporations possibly have private prisons, all of them.
How many is that?
I really don't know.
Representative Ong.
So with reference back to Mr. Crawford, does he look at the short-term benefits, or rather the short-term implications, or does he reference the long-term implications?
Curbing recidivism rates is definitely a long-term impact because that impacts individuals across their lifetime.
Representative Ong.
So when you talk about the qualifications of these prisons, right, do they just initially look at the qualifications, or do they continue looking at their said qualifications?
Well, for the majority of the states that I pointed out, that's the preliminary period. Obtaining a certificate to open a prison is what these administrators do, but then past that point, they have monitors to make sure that these individuals are keeping up on the business.
Representative Payne.
How do private prisons specifically bring down violence within private prisons? Like how compared to public prisons?
Specifically because they have monitors to regulate what their guards are doing on a daily basis.
Representative
Do these public prisons have harsher punishment if they weren't to follow up on the accountability checks than the private prisons?
Yeah, because then their certificate comes into contestment for their certification.
Representative
So when we take a look at the public prisons and private prisons, why not just go full on private prisons when they offer more benefits?
I think that's a really good question. I think we could definitely do that.
Representative
Why don't we do that in the status quo now?
Because there exist inmate populations, which are enormous, that are very hard to move from the public state institutions to private institutions.